what I was going to do is I was going to, first of all, welcome you, of course. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is our fifth Biosafety Now Twitter space. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Bryce Nichols. I'm typically the operator of the Biosafety Now Twitter account. If you see unprofessional things coming from it, that is my fault. So I apologize for that. I'm a co-founder of Biosafety Now and also a professor of genetics at Rutgers University. Biosafety Now, for those of you that don't know, is a nonprofit organization. We launched a little over 2 months ago. You can check out our website and sign up for our newsletter at www.biosafetynow.org. Basically, our mission is to stop this ridiculous self-regulation of dangerous experiments that's been going on for decades. We want to, protect the future against lab-generated pandemics by enforcing strict regulations that will make it very unlikely that you would see another lab-generated pandemic, assuming that COVID was one. We also want to reduce the risk by minimizing the number of high containment biolabs as well. So I'm joined today, so Michael Balter is our guest of honor, and I'm also joined today by Yana Lamberdinu, who is a member of the Biosafety Now leadership team, and is going to be running the conversation with Michael today. I also would like to point out that we are expecting to have Emily Kopp join us briefly today. She has to leave early at 7:30, so I was going to have her come on and join us for a little bit of the conversation. So I think, the last thing I'll say is if you have any questions, please DM them to me. We might take questions later. I don't know, Michael, it depends. Are you feeling potentially in the mood for questions, or I can screen them? I thought we could screen them maybe, because we've had some difficulty with live questions in the past. So,
yeah, I'm happy to deal with questions. I do think it probably works best if they DM them to you and then you relay them to me.
I agree.
I don't, want anybody to be censored, but I also don't want to be trolled at the same time. This is Twitter, after all. So I'll leave it to your discretion how you want to handle that. But it sounds like you relaying the questions is a good idea.
This is the first time we're going to try that, because we probably should have done that before. But yeah, never leave anything to me, because I will probably make a bad decision. You can ask Yana about that. But anyway, Yana, will you go ahead and unmute yourself and take it away from here? I'm going to add Emily into the speaker list too. So
great. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. So welcome everybody to this Twitter space. Tonight we have the honor to speak with Michael Balter, a veteran science journalist and fierce critic of much of US mainstream media's coverage of the SARS-CoV-2 origin question. I assume that many of us here are at the very least confused about how the media is handling this story. And we'll do a deep dive with Michael to get a better sense for how the most prestigious journalistic outlets in the Western world have botched so badly what might be the most important story of our century. These, of course, are the very outlets that shape people's understanding of complex realities, not only in the United States, but also across the globe. My personal interest in this issue, which I hope we'll home in on today, goes beyond what the media is doing wrong. It extends to what the effects of this wrong are on a global community that is reeling from loss, illness, and disability, and that is entitled to answers, entitled to accountability, and entitled to information that will help it to try and protect itself from future harm. My personal interest in this issue also extends to what this wrong tells us about the media's relationship to the public, especially at a time of crisis. A specific question that haunts me is this: If our mainstream media can do crisis reporting in a way that disempowers the disempowered and harms the harmed, don't we need to question whom mainstream media serves? Don't we need to figure out what we need to do to hold mainstream media accountable for wrongdoing? And don't we need to ensure that mainstream media reconnects with its duty to enlighten? Indeed, according to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, quote, public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy, unquote. I hope that justice and democracy will be at the center of our thought in this conversation. Before I introduce Michael, I'd like to share with you 6 ethics principles from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. 1. Journalists should provide context. They should take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting, previewing, or summarizing a story. 2. Journalists should gather, update, and correct information throughout the life of a news story. 3. Journalists should be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable. They should give voice to the voiceless. 4. Journalists should recognize a special obligation to serve as watchdogs over public affairs and government. They should seek to ensure that the public's business is conducted in the open and that the public records are open to all. 5. The highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. Journalists should deny favored treatment to advertisers, donors, or any other special interests, and resist internal and external pressure to influence coverage. And 6, journalists should expose unethical conduct in journalism, including within their organizations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael Balter. I think Michael, in my view anyway, is somebody who is exposing unethical conduct in journalism. Michael's journalism career goes back to the 1970s when he started at Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles. In the 1980s, he moved to Paris, where he worked as a travel writer and eventually became the Paris correspondent for Science magazine. Michael wrote for Science for 25 years before moving back to the US in 1997. He has taught general and science journalism at Boston University, NYU, and City College of New York. He runs the Substack newsletter, Words for the Wise. And he is a big presence on Twitter, which is where I had the fortune to meet him. Michael is one of very few journalists I'm aware of who have been offering real-time critiques of mainstream media's coverage of the origin of SARS-CoV-2. And that's why I followed him, because I personally experienced the coverage more like a form of thought control than a painstaking investigation into a complex and urgent matter. And Michael's insights confirmed for me that something had indeed gone very wrong. Fun fact, among all the people I follow on Twitter, Michael is probably the first to post things every morning, which means that when I'm up for a minute and see his tweets, I know we're somewhere close to sunrise and it's soon time to get up.
Right.
Last important thing to note is that over the course of the pandemic, Michael's personal views about the COVID-19 origins have gone from thinking a lab origin was a crazy conspiracy theory to strict neutrality to his current opinion that a research-related accident, while not proven, is the most likely explanation. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. Let me just correct one thing, and that is that I was in Paris for 30 years, so I've only been back in the United States since 2017, not
Yes, of course.
1997.
Yes,
No, no
exactly.
problem.
I'm so sorry. I'm
That's
so sorry.
no, it's quite
Perfect.
all right.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you for the
but
correction.
I was the Paris correspondent from 1991 until early 2016. So that's about 25 years. And also, I'll just add one thing because people are always saying, "What's your science background?" I I would add that I'm a refugee from a PhD program in molecular and cell biology at UCLA. I took my master's and ran and became a journalist, but that's a long story. I've had a very strong scientific background, and that was how I managed to become a correspondent for Science Magazine.
Well, that's really very helpful because I really did wonder how you became a science journalist, and I'd like to start actually by asking you what is a science journalist, and then again, how did you become one?
Okay, well, that's assuming I am one, which I think some people might question who don't agree with me about things. But um, in terms of how to dispense very quickly with how I became one, um, when I was living in Los Angeles, working for Pacifica Radio, KPFK in LA, and then after that, I started doing some freelance writing for both national publications like The Nation and The Progressive, and local publications like the LA Weekly and the Los Angeles Times. Um, I often used my scientific background to convince my editors that I was qualified to cover scientific topics. And that very early on became part of my mix in the years that I was still in Los Angeles. So, they there were a number of things that came up, such as spraying malathion all over Los Angeles to kill the fruit flies that were disrupting the citrus industry there and things like that. People wanted to know, is malathion bad for me? Should I be worried about it? And those were the kind of topics that I was able to cover. When I moved to Paris, which was in 1988, I married a British woman and ran off to Paris with her. Long, long romantic story. Um, there came a certain point I was doing political writing and some science writing for the International Herald Tribune. But after I had been there a few years, science, which had been very provincial previously and based mostly in the United States, began to open foreign bureaus, meaning foreign to the United States, in Tokyo and in Europe and so forth. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I saw that this was happening, and I sent the news editor at the time a letter. This was email was still very primitive back then, although it did exist, and I sent him a letter and said, "Hey, here I am. Do you need a Paris correspondent?" And before long, almost kind of by default, I became the Paris correspondent. Um, in terms of what is a science journalist, that's a really good question because I think that we have to make a distinction between a science journalist and a science writer. So, and I like to think that I'm both. And during the years that I was at Science, I did both. So I acted as a science writer in the sense that I would write about the latest scientific discoveries. I would write about scientific papers that were published. In the early days, I wrote a lot about AIDS and other infectious diseases, developmental biology, and so forth. And then I got very interested in archaeology and anthropology, and I focused mostly on that. So, uh, writing about what interesting research scientists were doing was the science writing part of what I was doing while I was in science. The science journalism part was when it became necessary to actually do some real investigative or real reporting into some kind of an issue that had come up, either a policy issue or some um, uh, unethical things that were going on in a particular lab or a conflict between researchers. I wrote about those kinds of things. And that kind of reporting required actual science journalism. In other words, to do investigations. And when you do science journalism, I'll just close with this for the moment. When you do science journalism, you don't believe what anybody tells you. When you do science writing, you kind of tend to just write down what people tell you. And, somebody says, oh, hey, this molecule binds to that molecule, and I figured out how it does it because some other enzyme comes in. And you write it all down. You get a couple of comments from other people who either say, yes, that's great, it's a major discovery, or no, I don't think it works that way. You write it all down kind of like a stenographer with a certain amount of writing flair, and you put it in the magazine. But basically, you're believing what people are telling you. Science journalism is kind of the opposite. You don't believe what anybody tells you, and you do your own investigation and trying to figure out what the facts are. And over the 25 years I was at Science, I did a lot of those kinds of stories.
This is really helpful. So, is science writing the same as science communication?
I think basically science communication, well, as you mentioned at the beginning, I taught uh, science writing and science journalism at the graduate level, both at Boston University and New York University. After that, I taught a year at City College of New York, right as the pandemic was starting. And there I taught just sort of general journalism to undergraduates. But a lot of people who go through science journalism programs, science writing programs, do become public relations people for institutions. And they and that is kind of what you think of sometimes when you think about science communication, that you're working for, say, a university or a lab or a pharmaceutical company or a research company or what have you, a biotech company, and you might be communicating the latest things that that particular institution or company is doing. So there's an overlap between being a science writer and a science communicator. They're not exactly synonymous, but they overlap a great deal.
Great. And so, can you tell us, since we're going to be focusing on a very specific story today, and this is the SARS-CoV-2 origin question, what, in your view, is important about this question? We know that there's people who don't think the question is important at all, and we should move on. I don't think you're one of them.
No.
What do you think is important about this question? And what do you think is the mainstream media's ethical responsibility to the public in covering this story?
Okay. Well, to take the first question, I mean, my opinion, yes, there are people who say, okay, it doesn't matter how the pandemic started. We've got to do the same stuff. We've got to control the wildlife trade, uh, which can lead to zoonotic spillovers. We've got to make sure that lab safety is uh, very tightly regulated. We've got to kind of do it all, and it doesn't matter which of the two main leading hypotheses turn out to be right for COVID origins. Um, I wish I wish the world were like that. I wish that that were true, but um, it's not true. And so, knowing the truth of how this pandemic started becomes very, very important. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and I promised in my own tweets and maybe in some of the responses to Biosafety Now's promotion of this event that I was going to name names, and I have been doing that for the last couple of years, and I'm going to do it tonight, because I think if you don't name names, if you don't give specific, it's not to shame people, but it's to give specific examples. And if I don't give specific examples, then nobody's going to really know what I'm talking about. So, um, Amy Maxman, who is a science writer at Nature, and who's very ubiquitous on social media, and particularly on Twitter, referred yesterday to the concern about biosafety, because we've had these articles now in the Washington Post and congressional hearings, and it's obviously biosafety is a very big deal, biosecurity. She called it an obsession, okay? And I took issue with that, the idea that biosecurity was an obsession. I think the right authors and readers of the series that the Washington Post has been doing on lab accidents would probably take exception to that as well, or certainly after they read those stories. So, you, if somebody is actively trying to downplay one of the two ways that we can cause a pandemic or an outbreak, then I think that they're doing a real disservice, no matter what the real origins of the pandemic are. And for that reason, we really have to focus on uh, everything that could possibly have led to this pandemic, and we need to know. Let's just be honest about it. If it turns out that lab origin is right, well, nobody's going to be able to call concerns about biosecurity an obsession anymore. You could just forget about tweeting that biosafety is an obsession if it turns out that a lab origin is correct. Um, Likewise, if anybody were tempted to say that the wildlife trade is some sort of an obsession or something that we're overly concerned about, if zoonosis turns out to be true, then nobody can be making that claim. So I don't mean to be facetious here, but we need to know, okay? So not because we wouldn't do pretty much the same things, hopefully to prevent pandemics, if we didn't know, but we need to know so we know what baskets to put most of our eggs in, where the holes are that the leaky holes are. If it turns out that um, uh, doing aerosol transmission experiments with H5N1 avian flu virus, uh, and doing aerosol experiments with ferrets is going to likely cause a pandemic of H5N1. Then we need to know that, and we need to know what the possibilities are there, so that we can regulate that. So I don't mean to go on too much, but I hope that gives you some kind of a convoluted answer to the question.
Yeah, this is great. And what do you think is the mainstream media's ethical responsibility to the public in covering the story?
Well, the mainstream media's ethical responsibility is to. I'll tell you what it is not. Okay, let me start off with a negative. Okay, and really cut to the chase here. A reporter or a publication is not fulfilling their ethical responsibility if they, as happened at the beginning of this pandemic, start telling people that a lab origin for this pandemic is just a crazy conspiracy theory. And I admit that that is what I thought at the very beginning, that that's what it was. I remember the first time somebody suggested to me that it could be a lab origin, and I kind of went, "What? Are you nuts?" And it was somebody who I respected quite a lot, so I was a bit surprised. But that's because I didn't know very much about it at the time. So you can't go around saying that a lab origin is a conspiracy theory when you don't know how the pandemic started. And remember that now, try to think back 3 years ago at the very beginning of the pandemic. Try to think back to January, February, March of 2020. Nobody had a clue what the origin of this pandemic was. And we know that lab accidents happen, and we know that they actually happen fairly often. And the latest series in the Washington Post should disabuse us of any illusions that that's not true. But many, many, many things have been published about that. So it's just simply not acceptable or ethical to tell people that something that is perfectly plausible is some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. So I'm kind of giving you a negative example. What to put it on a more positive framing, it's the ethical responsibility of journalists at a time of a pandemic when people are dying by the thousands and eventually by the millions today to actually investigate. And this is, Yana, we talked about this kind of, on Twitter DMs. But one of my contentions is that the mainstream media, until maybe recently, and still there are some awful examples, has not actually reported on the COVID origins issue. Okay. The Washington Post is a mainstream publication, a legacy publication. It's starting to do some really good things now. The New York Times is still, and I'll back this up as we go along, not reporting on the COVID origins issue. Now, it's a pretty blanket and perhaps jarring statement for me to be making, but they are simply not reporting on it. And reporting, and we taught our students this, back when I was at BU and NYU and City, reporting does not mean that you call up scientists on one side of an issue or scientists on the other side of an issue, write down what they say, and then put it in your article and then go home and have dinner. That is not reporting. But we've seen those kinds of articles in the New York Times and other publications just, very recently. And as a matter of fact, we've seen worse. Again, I'll just keep cutting to the chase during our conversation. We've seen worse than that. We've seen articles very recently in the New York Times where the reporter is not even bothering to talk to both sides of an issue, but only talks to one side of an issue, quotes what the people on one side of an issue say, puts it in the story, and goes home and has dinner. So the obligation of a journalist is to actually do journalism. And I hate to, be very aggressive, kind of starting out of the box here, but we could spend all night and into tomorrow talking about examples where that principle is not being followed.
So, one quick question that goes back to the first question I asked is, would you say that most of the reporters who've been writing about the story are science writers or science journalists?
I think yes. So the the New York Times brought in Carl Zimmer and Ben Mueller. The Washington Post brought in Joel Aschenbach. Science Magazine, of course, brought in John Cohen, who's been and John and I go way, way back 30 years, working together on AIDS reporting and other infectious diseases. I was in France. He was based in California, and we worked apart. We worked together, so we go back a long way. You bring in uh, science journalists to cover uh, these issues, and of course, the COVID coverage is not just COVID origins. Of course, as we all know, it's also covering vaccines. It's covering policy. It's covering long COVID. It's covering everything that the pandemic has hit us with. It's generally science journalists who are covering the scientific side of it. Now, as um, the we move into these congressional hearings, and the kind of scene kind of shifts to a certain extent to Washington and the hearings that are being held there, then we begin to bring in Washington correspondents. But even Cheryl Gay Stolberg, who's been covering the Washington side of things for the New York Times, is an experienced public health reporter. And so they brought in somebody who actually, has experience covering, public health matters. So I'd say a long-winded answer to your question, but I would say that generally it's the science journalists and health writers and medical writers who are covering, at least the science side of this. And, that's as it should be. They're the ones who have the special expertise to do that.
Sorry, Yana, can I just make a quick announcement here? So, unfortunately, Emily Koppa will not be able to join us, I don't think, because she unfortunately is on a desktop, not on her phone. But I did, if you don't mind, Michael, could you go back to you were mentioning, you brought up John
Yeah.
Cohen. And I would like you, if you are willing to comment, because I know that you took issue with his handling of receiving an anonymous email from somebody that was talking about attribution of the proximal origin paper. I don't know if that's something, and Yana, I don't if that's too much in the weeds. I just am very curious because I know you took issue with John very publicly about that, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, I did, and probably some of the people who are listening in know what I said. Let me just preface it, and let me say two things before I get into that. I'm going to be pretty brief about it. Um, and I know that our listeners to this are a mix of people who We're basically online 24 hours a day, sort of tweeting and following COVID origins. And hopefully there's a lot of people out there who don't have a clue what we're talking about. And so we want to be sure that, they're in the picture as well. You know, I was in science for 25 years. John and I uh, first knew each other and, uh, kind of worked partly together starting in about 1994, 1995, because the AIDS epidemic was still raging. That was John's main beat. I was based in France, home of Luc Montagnier and the Institut Pasteur and all that, and also a country that was hit in a very major way by the AIDS epidemic, as probably most of you, people listening in know, and where an enormous amount of research was being done in France and Italy and other countries around Europe. So I kind of had the European side of it, and John had the U.S. side of it. Although every once in a while we would kind of meet up at a meeting, either in Europe or in the United States, and we would kind of team up and cover things together. In 1998, John was on book leave the entire year, doing his book Shots in the Dark, which is quite a good book about the search for an AIDS vaccine, which of course we still don't have one. Um, and John was a damn good reporter back back in those days. Now, I'm not saying anything publicly that I haven't already said on Twitter or to him to his face. And if he's lurking around, John, you know, I hope you're doing well. Um, but in the early days, uh, John was the kind of reporter who would be extremely skeptical of any official story. And he used to chastise me because I would, there would be some paper, somebody claiming that they, had found some molecular configuration in the HIV envelope that was ripe for vaccine development. And I would get all excited, and John would be extremely skeptical, and he was usually right. So I learned an enormous amount from him. But fast forward to the present and to the pandemic, and the episode that we're talking about is that John received an anonymous email, a whistleblower. He referred to it himself as a whistleblower account of the meetings that had been held between Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, Jeremy Farrar of Wellcome Trust, Christian Anderson, Eddie Holmes, Andrew Rambo, and the others who were involved in the infamous proximal origins correspondence that appeared in March of 2020 in Nature Medicine. And somebody sent John an email giving him what purported to be kind of the inside scoop about what had gone on in those meetings. It was not somebody who was at the meeting, but was claiming that they were kind of like, talking to somebody who was at the meeting. And what John did was that he sent the email without just straight to Christian Anderson and to Eddie Holmes, who sent it straight to Anthony Fauci and to Francis Collins. And he didn't use any kind of a filter, anything to make sure that the person who had sent the whistleblower email might not be identified. He just sent it straight with the words, "This is what someone is saying behind your backs." Now, John would later, nobody knew about this for quite a very long time until Jimmy Tobias, who I hope will come up in this conversation a number of times tonight. But Jimmy Tobias, who's a fantastic independent reporter, writes for The Intercept, for The Nation especially, has done very, very important coverage. He, along with Emily and US Right to Know and others, have done a fantastic job getting and litigating for Freedom of Information Act documents from various public institutions, including, of course, the NIH and NIAID. So John was kind of, there's no way else to put it, but that John was caught out by one of these FOIA requests, and his correspondence with uh, uh, Anderson and Holmes and his forwarding to them of this whistleblower email was all exposed. Now, I think most or all of the email was redacted at the beginning. But and John argued that he shouldn't have to release that on various grounds. I won't get into the weeds on that. So, basically, and this is kind of now to cut to the chase on this. First of all, uh, by simply sending the email to Holmes and Anderson and saying this is what somebody is saying behind your back, that's not being a journalist. That's not how you ask somebody for comment. John would later claim that he was asking them for comment. That's not what you do. That is collusion. That's basically, hey, here's what somebody is saying. I think you should know this. That's not asking them for comment. That's not reporting. That's not trying to figure out what is this whistleblower trying to tell me. That's not following up on what they're on what's being told. Then John, but that was John's story, and of course at that point we hadn't seen the email. Then John said that this was a nothing burger, that there was nothing in the email, the whistleblower email, that was important. And then when he finally revealed it, he left out the most important part and then said that he had made a cut and paste error. So I have, accused, if he wants to sue me for defamation, he can. But I have accused John of being, shall we say, disingenuous and not conforming to the truth in all three contentions that he has made about this email. Now, why is it important? Okay, it's not important to try to slam John, but it's important because, in my personal opinion, neither John nor Science Magazine have done real reporting on the COVID origins front. Why is Jimmy Tobias and Emily Kopp and US Right to Know and Catherine Eben of Vanity Fair and Sharon Lerner and Mara, sorry, I can't pronounce her last name right. At the moment, it starts with an H, and she's an old colleague of mine from Science when she was reporting from China. Why are they the ones who are doing the Freedom of Information Act requests? Why are they the ones who are going after Anthony Fauci's emails? Why isn't the New York Times doing that? Why isn't Science doing it? Why isn't Nature doing it? The New York Times 120 years ago put out a statement that it was going to report without fear or favor, and that has become a motto for all of journalism, that reporters are supposed to do their jobs without fear or favor. That means you don't worry what Tony Fauci is going to think of you if you go after his emails, or Peter Daszak or anybody else. And you don't worry about losing access to Tony Fauci or Francis Collins or Peter Daszak or Jeremy Farrar if you go after their emails. You ask questions, what really happened here, and you go after all the documents you need to go after in order to tell the story. So this is kind of a case study in how to do it and how not to do it. You don't collude with your sources. You don't go to your sources and say, hey, I think you should know this. And by the way, here's an email that you might be able to use to identify who the whistleblower is. Okay, because there really was a danger that they could, and maybe they do know who the whistleblower is, strictly by looking at what the whistleblower said and what knowledge they had. We don't know that, but it certainly is a possibility. So, this is, again, I apologize for being long winded and for being heated about this, but some journalists are doing their job and some journalists are not. We would not know anything about what kind of research was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, what was going on with the proximal origins paper or correspondence, what was behind the Lancet letter that Peter Daszak published in February of 2020, calling the lab origin idea a conspiracy theory. The furin cleavage site and the proposals that were made to the military by Ralph Barrick at University of North Carolina, Peter Daszak of EcoHealth, and Shizheng Li of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the efforts that they made to get funding for inserting a genetic segment that would make the virus more infectious to people. We would not know about any of this if we relied on the New York Times and we relied on Science or Nature. That is an incredibly serious indictment of those publications, that we had to rely on independent journalists like Jimmy Tobias. He just tweeted today, "I'm scraping to make a living writing for Nature, which doesn't pay anything, or sorry, writing for The Nation, which doesn't pay anything, and for The Intercept, where you're paid a pittance when you write for those publications." Why did the so-called mainstream legacy media that has the money and the resources to do this kind of reporting, why did they not do it? Why have we had to rely on Jimmy Tobias and Emily Kopp and U.S. Right to Know? So that is really the big issue here, that I'm very, very concerned with this evening.
Can I ask? I'm sorry, Yana. One more question about this, because I'm fascinated by the fact that you know John for
Yeah.
decades. What is this uncharacteristic? This notion of not admitting to doing anything wrong when there appears to be some clearly shady stuff going on. What I don't quite get is there seems to be no admission that there might be any sign of something that looks a little bit off. Is this something like I don't quite see? Is this something that's uncharacteristic from him based on your relationship? Were you surprised that he didn't say, "Okay, my bad. This was actually not appropriate," for example?
Well, I don't want to make a lot of personal remarks about John,
I
uh,
know. Yeah, sorry.
but
I
what I,
guess maybe just a short
yeah,
answer on that, because I don't. Yeah, I don't want you to. I just a general question. Where does anybody have any self reflection and look to say maybe this? I can see how this looks a little bit
let
off
me
to
let me
people.
answer you this way: by tripling down on a story that has very little plausibility on the face of it about what happened between John and these emails and the whistleblower. Um, John has gone further than I think most journalists would go that I know. You know, Carl Zimmer at the New York Times is another old friend of mine. We've known each other 20 years. He may not feel that we're friends anymore, but because I've criticized him, quite a bit in his reporting for the New York Times. But it would surprise me if Carl did not say, hey, yeah, maybe I, should have handled this differently. Most journalists I know would. At the beginning, uh, in the introduction, Jana read the six major principles of the Society for Professional Journalists in terms of how journalists are supposed to comport themselves. And I'm sorry to say that and not, I'm suggesting that we go through them all, but um, during the course of this pandemic, I would say that the mainstream media, and I know that's a bit of a cliche, the mainstream media, but what we also call the legacy media, has violated all six of those principles at one time or another. And um, one of the principles is that you be transparent, that you immediately respond to any questions or suggestions that your reporting is incorrect, and that you do that in a transparent way. We don't really see much of the legacy media acting that way on COVID origins. And, because of that, um, it reinforces the feelings of justification that obviously some reporters and editors have of continuing to not really do their jobs on the reporting on COVID origins.
So it sounds like, Michael, that what the behavior that you described of John Cohen um, is not just a bad apple, personal failing necessarily just of John's, but we're really looking at probably, bigger institutional a problem with collusion with sources. It almost looks like, and and I wonder if should our attention be focused on the reporters themselves, or would you say that editors in these newspapers might have something to do with what's going on? And I'm thinking in the specific case of John Cohen that there is this guy Holden Thorpe that you might be able to talk to us a little bit about, and is there a role he is playing, and are we unfair to be criticizing the reporters when perhaps it's people higher up above them who are making the big decisions?
Well, I think I have to answer that in a couple, at least two or three different ways, okay, if you don't mind. Because, you've got the individual reporter, you've got the editors, you've got the institutional setting and the societal setting that all this is going on in. And let me kind of try to take you through it step by step, if you like. Um, it may very well be true that there are individual reporters who are really wedded to a particular interpretation or a particular explanation for the pandemic, usually a zoonotic spillover explanation. Almost all mainstream science journalists um, are lean that way, and in some cases extremely heavily. And I could give a few examples, but we can get to that in a minute. Um, and I think that in many cases that the editors that they are working with are generally have the same orientation. I do want to kind of correct one thing about science, though, and Holden Thorpe, Holden Thorpe, and um, the remember that I was at Science for 25 years, and we had what we call the separation of church and state. And over 25 years, I rarely saw it violated. We would argue about which was church and which was state, but depending on which one you want to designate. But the news department at Science, and I believe that it's similar in nature, but definitely at Science, is independent of what we called editorial. And editorial were the editors who handled peer-reviewed manuscripts. Now, although nominally Holden Thorpe is the editor in chief of Science, he does not run the news department. And when I was at Science, I worked for most of the time I was at Science. I worked under Colin Norman, who's been retired for a number of years, and we were totally free. We would often do news stories about science papers, and we were totally free to critically cover science papers. I don't know how many times I would, set out to report on a paper that was about to be published in Science, and somebody would say to me, I don't know how that got past peer review, and we would put all the criticisms into the news story, despite the fact that it was a story in Science. So Holden Thorpe is not running the news department. And are there management meetings at the American Academy, at Science, of top level? Are there meetings in which the news editor, Tim Appenzeller, who I worked with the last years that I was at Science, and Holden Thorpe are at the same meeting? Yes, but generally those meetings don't discuss, the news coverage. So it's a misconception to think that Holden Thorpe is directly controlling what appears in the news pages of Science, what John Cohen writes. That doesn't mean that there may not be some tacit agreement between one side and the other over the orientation of the magazine in terms of both publishing and doing news stories. But let me tell you this, and I know Tim Appenzeller. I worked with him for 20 years. He was the deputy news editor, and then he was the news editor, and I've known him for a very long time. If John Cohen went to Tim, or Carl Zimmer went to Ginny Hughes, one of the science editors, people on the science desk at the New York Times, and said, "You know what? I'm really beginning to have doubts about the zoonotic spillover theory. I think the lab leak people have made some arguments that are a little bit hard to get around, or that at least really need serious consideration. I think we should put some resources into looking into this. That would probably make the difference. Certainly it would at science. If John went to Tim and said, hey, what? you know, I know I've been, kind of really, kind of leaning towards zoonosis all this time, but, I've just listened to Richard Ebright and, Alina Chan, on Biosafety Now, or to Steve Massey, or just, on Frank Sweeney's, Straight Talk MD. And I think these folks might have something. There's nothing stopping these folks from shifting gears and really doing this coverage. In the meantime, Jimmy Tobias and Emily Kopp and other reporters, Catherine Eben and others, have basically left science in the New York Times in the dust. And, somebody was asking me the other day, well, why is the Washington Post all of a sudden, coming out gangbusters, covering lab leaks and lab accidents? Why did they have a long editorial segment last November in which they published Gilles Demonoeff's study, extremely important study, of the fact that China did not report all of the cases to WHO, and that the famous Werby and Picard papers from last July were based on very, very incomplete data. Why are they doing that? Well, I don't know. But one possible reason is that the Washington Post, may just be sitting there and saying, hey, we're not going to be left behind here. And if the New York Times isn't going to do it, then we're going to do it. And they have obviously really been running some very, very powerful stuff just over the last couple of days, especially. So, will the New York Times and science ever catch up? Or will, in 2 years from now, will we be, reading articles by Carl Zimmer and John Cohen? How did we get it wrong? Where they all of a sudden become the wise men who tell us, how we all, missed the boat on the origins of COVID. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious now, but that's the kind of thing you can expect if the lab origins advocates and proponents, really end up proving their stuff at some point down the line.
Right. Well, I'd like to ask you, do you remember, because we were talking about, in the introduction, how you at first yourself thought that, research related origin was far fetched and a conspiracy theory. Do you remember the first time that you yourself felt that there was something seriously wrong with the reporting of the origin story? And how do you explain? This is the second part of my question. How do you explain what has been going on? How do you explain that John's behavior, for example, is really not just John? It is not just science. That we're seeing the same type of conduct in multiple newspapers, across the nation. What is going on, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I do have some opinions about that. There are opinions that don't make everybody happy, but they're nevertheless my opinions. To answer your first question, um, I don't remember exactly when anybody, at the beginning of the pandemic, nobody was saying that this could be a lab leak or a lab, accident in Wuhan. There wasn't much talk about that because what was being discussed was, oh, Shi Zhengli, the Batwoman from Wuhan, was on the job, and they were going to, they had investigated SARS-1, and they were now going to investigate SARS-2, and George Gao, who was at that time the head of the Chinese CDC, was on the job. And, there was a lot of respect for these Chinese scientists that they were seriously looking at this. And at that, in the very early days, and it may just be that I wasn't reading the right stuff, but I was reading science in the New York Times and what have you, Washington Post. But it was not on my radar originally that that this was kind of a possibility. And I think I saw the coverage of the Kalischer et al. Paper in the Lancet the one that was actually orchestrated by Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance, saying that it was a conspiracy theory. And that's kind of, I was not covering COVID at that point. I was paying attention, but not covering it. And then somebody who shall remain nameless, but somebody who has a scientific background and whose opinion I expect a lot, started saying to me, I think this was a lab accident. And I kind of went, oh, what makes you think that? Kind of thinking in the back of the mind, oh, my friend has got off the deep end, he's got off the rails. And he started kind of giving me some reasons, and they weren't really very convincing. I think around that time, I either read an article or became aware on social media of Alina Chan and her, as it now turns out, quite courageous efforts, a young postdoc there in Cambridge, Mass, to at least get people to take the possibility of a lab leak or lab accident or lab related or research related incident seriously. And I'm a leftist from way back and a union man and all that. And so I'm always rooting for the underdog, and I started reading about Alina's, pretty brave struggle to brave ridicule and brave everybody saying you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, you're just a postdoc and all this, and the kind of things that people were saying to try to put this discussion, on the table. And obviously, she, in the end, was very successful in doing that. She did the book with Matt Ridley, Viral. I became aware of Richard Ebright, who's obviously a member of your organization, and his very long-standing concern about biosafety and biosecurity issues. So eventually, I, was able to kind of hook up with what people were saying. And then, of course, some of the reporting started to come along in The Intercept and Catherine Eben and Vanity Fair. And it became possible to actually have a discussion about it. Of course, May 2021 was a major, there's been a lot of, back and forth turning points. May 2021, of course, was the letter that Jesse Bloom of the Fred Hutchinson and a number of other scientists published in Science, saying that a lab origin had to be taken seriously and that we needed a serious investigation. And WHO began saying the same thing around the same time. So all of a sudden, you had a situation where you had a number of very reputable scientists, including virologists, saying, hey, we need to take this seriously. We need to investigate. This is not a slam dunk for zoonotic spillover. And that was the point, I think, which not just me, but a lot of people, began to take it more seriously. And so did the media. There was a splash of media stories around May of 2021 in which that letter in Science was covered. And the reporters talked to people and said, this is a possibility that we have to consider. There were also some bad reactions that some of you may remember. People having to delete tweets that they regretted, saying that it was a racist conspiracy theory and that kind of stuff. And that didn't fly, especially when the person making that kind of tweet was a staff reporter at the New York Times. I think some people know what I'm talking about. I'm just going to kind of leave it there. Again, another friend of mine and colleague doing that. Now, to go to your second question, and which is the more global question, why has this happened? This is where I it's kind of a pox on both your houses kind of situation, because I wrote a piece in TruthDig, which is a progressive online site with a venerable history. It's been around for a very long time, called The Politicized Virus. And I think it's one of the few things that I ever did or wrote that Richard E. Wright didn't. I don't know. I don't know if he's listening or not. Did either like or retweet, because what I did is that I blamed both sides, and what I basically said, and I think this is the political and social context for the reporting and for your question. And that is that we very, very unfortunately suffered a very sharp politicization of the COVID origins issue, where most people on the right were pointing the finger at China, and most people on the left were pointing the finger at the Huanan market, pardon my Chinese pronunciation, which is not very good, at the seafood market in Wuhan, and more recently at the poor raccoon dog. I've said, jokingly on Twitter that if I were either a pangolin or a raccoon dog, I would have sued for defamation a long time ago, getting blamed for this pandemic. But the whole thing became extremely politicized, and uh, the there were serious stakes. Okay, so I find blame on both sides. As I wrote in the article in Truthdig, the Trump camp and the right wingers began to point the finger at China in a way that eventually turned out to be really quite racist and anti-Asian. Now, some people have taken exception saying to that and said, no, 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 Trump didn't say anything against China until around March 7th, 2020. Well, that's true, but Trump's minions like Steve Bannon were uh, pointing the finger at China and blaming China uh, as early as January 25th of 2020, long, long before, 6 weeks before Trump said anything. Why Trump waited until March to begin to make remarks about China is sort of a whole nother question that we can perhaps get into some other time. But the right wing identification with blaming China and attacking China um, began much, much earlier. It began in January. And remember that the pandemic didn't really become a serious problem in the United States until around March. It wasn't until March that it became really clear that we were really in deep shit and that people were going to die and that this was really serious and that there was no way we were going to be able to avoid the spread. At that point, Trump began to talk about Kung Flu and at his rallies and so forth, and making a lot of just blatantly racist remarks. So what so I blame the right for creating that atmosphere, okay? But I also blame the left and most science journalists and most journalists in the United States, period, tend to be liberal politically. That is true. It's not just a kind of a right wing talking point. It is true that most journalists tend to be left of center. Um, there may be some interesting reasons for that, but we don't need to discuss them tonight. But I would say that kind of a panic set in, that what people saw was, and what journalists who were trying to cover the pandemic saw, was that Trump and the right wing in the United States was dissing any and all mitigation efforts to try to stop the spread of the virus. And that's still pretty much going on today. The debates around masks, the debates around vaccines, and so forth and so on continue to have very much this left right divide. I think that a lot of science journalists and a lot of editors and a lot of journalists felt that their job was to fight disinformation. And that meant that you needed to find sort of a quick and easy way or a shortcut to the kind of reporting that they should have been doing. Well, what's one way to have a shortcut to actually doing reporting and probing an issue? You use argument from authority. So you go to Tony Fauci, you make a hero out of Tony Fauci, you make him into kind of an icon, you make him the authority figure, and it's Dr. Fauci says this, and Dr. Fauci says that, and Dr. Fauci says the other. And you try to stem what you, as a liberal journalist, think is a tide of reactionary denialism that's going to cause many more people to be killed. And I see sort of truth on both sides of this. And this is where a lot of people don't like what I say because I'm putting blame on both sides of the equation here to the extent that this issue became politicized. Now, it is still the case today. What is it, April 12th, 2023? It is still the case that the issue is politicized, and you've got the Republicans up leading the congressional committee hearings in Congress, and you've got the Democrats either, kind of playing resistance with that, or passing, or not participating, or being, antagonistic to it. So I'm to the left of the Democratic Party in terms of my, full disclosure in terms of my personal politics, although I vote Democratic. But if Jim Jordan's getting up there and slamming Tony Fauci and thinking that he should be hung from a lamppost or sent to jail because of the pandemic, in my opinion, the Democrats have only themselves to blame for that because they did not seize the day when they had an opportunity to take the initiative in terms of pushing for a real investigation into COVID origins. And the exact same thing is true of more liberal leaning science journalists who took shortcuts and decided that they were going to go with what Dr. Fauci said rather than doing the real reporting that they needed to do. And as I said at the beginning, instead of Carl Zimmer or John Cohen or Ben Mueller getting Fauci and Collins's emails, which are extremely revealing in terms of the way that those individuals try to control the narrative about COVID origins, they left it to Jimmy Tobias and Emily and Catherine and others to do that. So the politicization of the COVID origins debate has worked to the detriment of our finding the truth for 3 years now. And it's kind of time to bring it to a close. It's heartening for me to see so many right wingers on my Twitter feed, thousands of them. I never thought that would ever happen because on any other issue other than COVID origins, you know, I'm to the left of Jesse Jackson, whatever. So it's extremely interesting to see this point of overlap. But we need to stop politicizing it because it's just not doing anybody any good. And as I said, it's getting in the way of our finding out the truth. Okay.
All right,
So,
Michael. I'm sorry.
Michael,
Oh, Yana, do you want to? I had you said a lot there,
I
Michael.
know, I did.
Now, Richard, of course, can't respond to you, but I did want to note there were a couple. So, yeah, you said a lot of things, but I guess I'll sort of push back on maybe two of
Sure.
them. One is giving. So this is something that Paul Thacker said. I know you're good friends with Paul.
Right.
I He said that giving a lot of weight to a podcast that Steve Bannon did in January is sort of, not a very compelling argument about that the right wing was pushing this in January. I mean, there is something about, you could, is that kind of cherry picking that there was this right wing guy in January with an audience of 12 people that was saying something. I think that was what he was implying. The other thing I would push back on is the idea, and maybe this was a misstatement. You were implying that the Democrats, after their initial, we're the party that's going to protect you against COVID spread, is still doing that. I think that ship has long since passed. I think both the Democrats and Republicans are now sort of jointly just letting it rip, frankly.
Let,
I mean, so really, the origins might be the only thing where there's still that polarization. But I don't see the Democrats as doing any better job in terms of controlling the spread of COVID. Certainly, I think that was something we had all hoped would happen, but I'm not sure that really did. And I am also a Democrat. I will say,
yeah.
just so you're.
Well, on the second thing, I think that's really an interesting question. Let me take the second one first. um, Nobody in this country has done a good job of uh, controlling the pandemic. And there are complicated reasons for that. And uh, I think that neither side has done a good job of getting people on board with what needed to be done to stem the tide of the pandemic very early. And in terms of the politics, it doesn't depend. I disagree with Paul because I was around here, and Paul's over in Spain. Not to not to pull country rank on him, but Paul's over there in Spain, and that doesn't mean that he can't have a very good idea about what's going on in the United States. But what you have to remember is that Trump and others around him, but especially Trump, was calling the COVID outbreak a Democratic Party hoax from the very, very beginning. Maybe he didn't talk about Kung Flu until March, but he was. You remember that he didn't want the people on the cruise ship to come aboard because if they came aboard with cases of COVID, that would count against his 20 cases of COVID, which he thought was pretty good. That dates to the very, very beginning. That dates to late December to early January. Um, so I think it's just completely inaccurate to say that what Steve Bannon was saying, what Tom Cotton said early in February. And Tom Cotton did not really, say it was a bioweapon. That was just one possibility that he mentioned. He got a bad rap on that, and I agree with that. But he was nevertheless pointing the finger at China in early February. In my piece for the Truth Dig, the politicized virus, I go over this timeline in a lot of detail so people can look at it there. So I disagree with Paul. It wasn't just Steve Bannon with 12 people. Steve Bannon has a huge audience for his podcast. There was a very popular writer at the Washington Examiner who had done a story pointing the finger at China. And as a matter of fact, Bannon had, I forget his name now, William something or other, but it's in the story. But Bannon had him on his program the next day after this reporter for the Washington Examiner has done his story. The idea that Republicans and Trump in particular were not pointing the finger at China or trying to pretend there was no pandemic in January of 2020 is just really controverted by the facts. And why were they doing that? And why in March? I said that we didn't necessarily have to get into it, but why did Trump, after kind of making nice with China for a couple of months and saying, "Oh, the Chinese are doing a wonderful job," suddenly turn on them in March? Because a lot of people were blaming Trump for the pandemic getting out of control by March. March of 2020 was when I took my class of undergraduate journalists at City College and said, "We're going on Zoom. Okay, we're not coming to class anymore." And I went home and signed everybody up for Zoom, and we started teaching, doing the class at home, and so did a lot of other people. City College, unfortunately, the CUNY system was one of the last university systems in the country to go remote, and that's a whole other story. So March was the point at which it became clear that we were going to have a pandemic in the United States, and that a lot of people on the left were blaming Trump for it, for playing denialism during the previous 2 months. So I think that's the factual context in which all of this was taking place. As far as the Democrats and Fauci, um, again, I go back to the taking shortcuts, and the argument from authority. Well, uh, smooching up to Tony Fauci and calling him Dr. Fauci and having him on and having Fauci, bobble dolls and Fauci T-shirts and all this kind of stuff, was preaching to the choir. The Trump supporters and people on the right didn't go for all that. It was only convincing to those people who were already convinced, and because of that, we didn't end up having the consensus in the country that we really needed to have to limit the number of cases. And we all know that the death rate in the United States was extremely high compared to most other countries.
By the way, Michael, it looks like, so I don't know, Jimmy Tobias entered the space. If he would like to speak,
Love to hear from
I
Jimmy.
invite.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know if you're on phone or not, Jimmy, and you want to speak. I've invited you to speak, but if you want to, please do, because your name came up several times earlier.
In a
Sorry,
very
go on.
positive context.
Yeah, I don't think he may not be able to speak, but sorry, Yana, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. Michael, I was wondering about, we're talking about the politicization, and it sounds like you are attributing uh, uh, the bad reporting, at least in part, to that. And what comes up for me is I'm thinking about the work of Ryan McIntyre, who's on this call right
Mm-hmm.
now. She's written
Dark
um,
Winter, right?
uh, she's written the book Dark Winter, and also Alison Young, who's written extensively about um, research related leaks and lab leaks and all of that. And it sounds like that we have a pretty long history of attempts to cover up, um, lab leaks in the past. So, against this backdrop, I'm just wondering what your opinion is. Are you thinking that even though there is this history, if, let's say, the U.S. administration in 2020 were, let's say, a Democratic administration. Let's say it was still Obama who was running the country. Do you think that the United States would not have, or the media in the United States would not have the same inclination to try to control the narrative in a specific way?
Well, that's it's very difficult to say because we're kind of predicting, trying to talk about a hypothetical and going back in the past and what were the conditions. Um, there's no question in my mind, at any rate, the way I see it, that if the Democrats had been saying we have to consider all possibilities, a lab leak is a possibility, I think that we would not have seen, obviously, liberal journalists kind of running over to the other side. And we remember, but how it really would have gone, uh, I think it's just really too difficult to know since those, were not the conditions. I think it would have been different. Would the would would the right wingers all have said, no, 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 don't blame China for this. It was just an innocent, raccoon dog that got out of control in the seafood market. That's a little hard to imagine. You might have had, if the Democrats were blaming China, you might have had, bipartisan consensus, that China was to blame at that point. Who knows? It's really kind of hard to predict.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. Yes, it is. That's right. So I mean, just to um, go back to the point you were making about politicization, and you were saying that part of the goal for some of these journalists probably was to fight disinformation, and of course they resorted to using argument from authority.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, is this really the best way to go as a journalist in trying to fight disinformation? Or why is it that in at the end of the day one could argue that these journalists fought disinformation with disinformation? I mean, why wouldn't they think, in fact, precisely because we are in an ocean of disinformation, this is the time to stick very strongly to ethical principles of journalism, to serious investigation, to exploring all hypotheses with rigor, to not just amplify theories of just people you trust and to deliberately discount theories of people you don't like? Like, how is this? How was this approach? How could they have thought of it as a proper and sound way to fight disinformation?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I was on with Frank Sweeney's Straight Talk MD program podcast, and we talked about this actually in quite a bit of detail. And I'll kind of repeat some of the things that I said. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but might refer people over to that discussion for a longer answer. But I used in that discussion, I used the model of climate change. So there is a point, and this is what we taught our students when I was at BU and NYU. There is a point at which you make a judgment, both as a scientist or as a journalist, that there is a scientific consensus around a particular issue, and you stop kind of both sides, doing both sides every time you do a story. For many years, journalists covering climate change would quote the climate skeptics, and they would quote those who thought that the planet was warming and that it was due to human activity. And that went on for a number of years. People forget how long that argument went on for. Um, but there came a point at which there was a real scientific consensus. Now, scientific consensus does not mean 5 virologists who are constantly quoted in the media and are active on Twitter say there's a scientific consensus. Scientific consensus really means that an overwhelming majority, like, in the 90 percentiles of scientists are saying and agreeing to one kind of basic principle. And it got to be that way with climate change. The number of scientists, every once in a while you'll get a retired weatherman, who will say, no, this is a bunch of crap. And I know, Matt Ridley, who wrote the book with Alina Chan, is a climate change skeptic to a certain degree. So there are people, even scientists, people with PhDs and, others, who still think that climate change is overblown or is or very, very skeptical about it. But there's definitely a scientific consensus. Well over 90% of the experts and the people who study it. That has never. We don't really know in the case of COVID origins what scientists think. All we know is what a handful of virologists and their friends think. And I'm not being exaggerating here. Nobody has taken a poll, nobody has taken a survey. I am followed by hundreds of scientists on my Twitter feed and see them liking things that I say that are raising issues about the coverage of the COVID origins issue and the COVID origins debate. So I know that there are a lot of scientists out there, and you who are, in Biosafety Now, probably know it much better than I do because you're the ones who aren't in touch with them and who interface with them all the time. So, but because, and I go back to what I said about, a pandemic and millions of people dying, that journalists took a shortcut, that they used the climate change model, which I think is legitimate. I think it's absolutely fine for the New York Times to do a story about climate change and rising sea levels and so forth and so on, without in every single article quoting somebody who thinks it's all a bunch of rubbish. I think that there is enough of a consensus that you don't have to do that. But we're nowhere near close to that on COVID origins. There was never any excuse or justification for journalists to treat the COVID origins issue as though it was resolved, except for a few crackpots, who wouldn't accept, what was supposedly the obvious evidence for zoonosis. We've never been anywhere close to that. We are nowhere close to that. And anybody who claims that the majority, I see this all the time still in the media, the majority of scientists think, most scientists think, based on what survey, based on what data, based on what information. There's no basis for that. But, a pandemic, a 100-year pandemic with millions of people dying around the world can create a certain degree of panic and a certain temptation to cut corners for journalists and for scientists alike, and to just simply kind of take the easy route. And that's when you start making arguments from authority. So you say, okay, well, these 3 really well-known virologists say that there's no evidence for a lab leak, so they must be right. And you put that in the New York Times. And that's basically what we've been seeing for the last 3 years. And it's really what has to change. I said this to you, Yana, in a DM exchange that we were having before the event tonight, and that is that this pandemic has been a real test for all of humanity. And I think everybody realizes that. It's been a test for us and for the human species in a lot of ways. All of us who are alive now were not alive until in 1918, the last time we had a really major killer worldwide pandemic of this type. So it's been a test for that for us, and we've never been through through anything like this before. It's also been a test for journalism, and I'm really sorry to have to kind of be, probably what will end up being my last word, that that mainstream journalism, the publications that we rely most on to keep us informed, have also failed the test of rising to the occasion of accurately, objectively, properly, fairly covering the issue of how this pandemic began.
Yeah, and I mean, it's remarkable to hear about the climate change shortcut. I do understand it, and it's really helpful to hear this insider information about how these news agencies, may have reacted. And again, it's just so difficult to swallow that all these people, because we're not just talking about one person, that all these different incredibly prestigious news outlets made the mistake to use climate change the shortcut when there's very clear differences from the COVID origin story. The one is, of course, the real consensus that you're talking about, but there was a false consensus. There's no consensus in terms of a market spillover among scientists. And also, the other thing that I think is very different is that with climate change, there has been a very long history of warnings about warming temperatures. With the market spillover, really what we have is actually a pretty robust history of alarms about lab safety and lab leaks. We also have had the Obama administration moratorium. Like there is that history, right? So the idea that we've had a history of people saying, "My goodness, we are, um, we are playing with fire," and then fire shows up, and the pretty much whole body of mainstream journalists in the United States take the wrong shortcut. It's a little bit hard to wrap one's head around.
Well, I agree with that. I'm sitting here. I surrounded myself with. I'm a bit old-fashioned, so I print things out and underline and circle things. When I read things instead of reading online, like I guess the younger generations do. And I'm sitting here with Alison Young's excerpt from her new book, Pandora's Gamble, which I've already pre-ordered on Amazon in USA Today. I'm sitting here with the two articles that the reporters from the Washington Post wrote about lab safety issues, including in the second installment in China itself. And this is reporting. This is, this is the the grits or the meat of the reporting that should have been done over the past 3 years. I'm sorry I have to pick on Amy Maxman again, but in the light of everything that's been published in the last couple of days, for a science journalist to say that concern over lab safety is an obsession is just unbelievable. And I can't believe that very many people are going to be able to continue to say that for very much longer. And, although I think that a lab origin or some kind of a research related incident, accident, there are many different scenarios, as I think most people know about how this could have happened. Although I think it's more likely now, given the balance of the evidence, it may be that the so-called zoo crew is it's like the sharks and the jets, the zoo crew versus the lab leakers, the two camps, it's possible that, somebody will find an intermediate host, that maybe it's the raccoon dog, maybe it's something else, and that there will turn out to be some reasons why we haven't found it yet, that there'll turn out to be some reasons why the virus showed up in Wuhan, of all places, and never anywhere else, anywhere between the bats in Wuhan, no spillovers at any other farm or market or any other town or any other situation. Maybe zoonosis will turn out to be right in the end. Who knows? But even if it does, it doesn't change the fact that we now know a lot that we should have known a long time ago about lab safety that we're just finding out about now. I mean, how many people knew until Josh Rogan published it in the Washington Post a couple of years ago that the State Department had gone and inspected the Wuhan Institute of Virology and found all kinds of lab safety issues there? How many people knew before, I don't forget whether it's Jimmy Tobias or US Right to Know, who dug out these particular emails of the Fauci Collins Farrar emails, that Jeremy Farrar was referring to the Wuhan lab as the Wild West because he knew from the intel that there were lab safety issues at the WIV. Why am I not reading that in the New York Times? Why am I reading it in, um, other places? And all the more power to those independent journalists who have brought these things to light. But, thank God that they have done the work that they've done, or we would be so ignorant. I said that at the beginning. And I just, I know that sometimes I emote a little bit, but do you realize what we would not know if all we relied upon was Science Magazine or Nature or the New York Times? We would know nothing about this pandemic at all. All we would know would be what a few people, we would know what Peter Daszak told us at the beginning, and Tony Fauci told us at the beginning, and a handful of virologists and immunologists, and we would know nothing else.
That's really scary, and I do agree. I think that's exactly what would happen. I want to ask you. It's a little bit past
Sure.
8:30. Might you be able to stay until 9 o'clock?
Yeah, I can keep going. I can talk all night, which is, probably,
Okay.
which some people consider to be a good thing, and some people don't. But
Well, we do.
okay.
We do.
If there's
And
still
I'm
if
wondering,
there's still people listening, if everybody hasn't gone to bed already.
there are people listening, and I also would like to invite folks again, if you have questions or comments, to send them through direct message to the Biosafety Now Twitter account. That would be great. We would love to hear from everybody. Um, Before we uh, move to questions, I want to ask about, this is very much connected to the very grim picture you just painted for us about what reality would have looked like without the low-paying hero journalists who are doing all the work that the legacy media is not doing, which is another incredibly scary and utterly unjust dynamic. To go to the term that you've used many times, I think on Twitter, the idea of journalistic
Yeah.
malpractice. Um, when I hear the term journalistic malpractice, I assume that there are ethics principles that have been violated and shouldn't have,
Hmm.
and that there are mechanisms in place to hold violators accountable. Um, and I'm wondering, what happens when there is within the world of journalism a violation of an ethical principle or multiple, as in this case, and are there accountability mechanisms, or is this just all kind of a feel good discourse that doesn't really have teeth?
Well, it depends on what country you're in. So, unfortunately, the bad news is in the United States, and that is that unfortunately, the Society of Professional Journalists has no. It has the code of ethics that you read from at the beginning. It has no enforcement mechanism for doing anything if somebody violates any of those things. You know, if I don't like something that's in the New York Times, several years ago, the New York Times did something I didn't like on a completely different subject. And I wrote in and complained, because it involved something that I was reporting about. And, uh, they just kind of basically blew me off. They didn't feel that they needed to take me seriously, and they did nothing about it. So in the United States, there's no enforcement mechanism. In the UK, where you have the National Union of Journalists, which is kind of both a guild like the Society for Professional Journalists is, and a labor union both, there are in the UK press complaint mechanisms. I think it's called the press complaints something. If there's anybody British listening in, they can chime in or tweet and remind me what the name of it is. But there is a formal procedure that you can go to complain about a publication, and it has a certain amount of teeth. If you lose the case, then you are obligated to either do a retraction or set it right, and so forth. France has a similar mechanism. I cannot remember now exactly who runs it or who controls it, but there is a mechanism in France and probably in other European countries. Um, there's probably a correlation between how uh, much there is an enforcement mechanism on what journalists do and the strength of the defamation laws. So in the United States, and I'm not arguing that that should change, but in the United States, it's very difficult to win a defamation case. The fact that Dominion looks about ready to win against Fox News is a very unusual. Uh, People who are following that case is a very unusual development, mainly because Fox has basically, been found to be guilty as charged in the civil sense in terms of defaming Dominion. But um, generally, our defamation laws are very favorable to reporters and to individuals here. And that seems to correlate with the fact that there are very weak controls against journalists who make mistakes or who deliberately get things wrong. Whereas in the UK, France, I think Australia as well has a press complaints set up. Defamation law is very strong in favor of the person who feels that they are defamed. So there seems to be kind of a correlation there. So it's a problem. It's a serious problem because there's not really any way to uh, enforce these codes of ethics. It's completely voluntary. And when I think somebody is doing something wrong, I usually tag in the SPJ, but that doesn't mean that anybody's looking at the tweets or doing anything about it. Now, the best thing that I've been able to do, and I don't know if we've given the listeners some links, but in Quill, which is the magazine of the SPJ, just a week or two ago, I did a story about the um, COVID coverage. It was fairly mild because this is a professional organization, and I didn't, I did name a few names actually in that. Amazingly enough, I was allowed to do that, but I did. That was kind of my version of complaining to my professional organization because I'm a member about the reporting, which was that I did this article, and fortunately, the editor of Quill saw fit to run it. So I would refer people to that because I think that that is the closest I've been able to come personally to taking issue with what other journalists have done.
So, this is it's alarming to me to hear this because it doesn't sound like we have much recourse as members of the public, both in the United States and abroad. Um, and and I'll say that one of the things that worries me tremendously about what has happened is that, you mentioned before that the media really hasn't covered the origin story,
No,
which is a provocative statement, and I agree. I think that the media has done something worse. I think that it has covered the story in a way that stigmatizes critical thinking and critical questioning, that it makes you feel dumb or morally challenged if you dare admit to yourself that what you're reading is unconvincing. and let alone admit it to others. And I'm speaking from personal experience because I've heard so much criticism from a lot of people, including family members, when I say, this is not appropriate reporting. There's much more to the story. This is not how you investigate a complex social scientific issue. So, if our mainstream media in this country is actually in some ways suppressing critical thinking and critical questioning at a time of crisis, what do you think that tells us about science journalism's view of the public and its relationship to the public?
Boy, that's kind of a tough one, really, because um, I don't think that the science journalists that I know, and remember, I've been in this world for decades, and know everybody. The science, or not everybody, but I know most of the stars, in the field because, um, uh, I've been around for so long. Um, I don't think it's that they have disdain for the public, or that they look down on the public, or that they, even think that they're fooling the public. I think that it's a more or less automatic, unconscious identification with institutions and establishments. So you identify with Tony Fauci, you identify with the scientists, you identify with the expertise of those scientists that you choose to trust. But, the consequence is that um, people go elsewhere for information. Okay. Now, you know, on the COVID origins thing, you might go to The Intercept or The Nation, where people like Jimmy Tobias and other great reporters have been doing their reporting. Vanity Fair, where Catherine Eben has been. Vanity Fair is not exactly an alternative, uh, independent publication, but nevertheless, it has hosted her, excellent investigative reporting on this. Um, but you go everywhere, kind of, but the New York Times and Science. So if you're on the left, you might go to The Intercept or The Nation, where Jimmy's been publishing quite a bit lately. If you're on the right, maybe you'll go to Epic Times or Steve Bannon's, Breitbart, or uh, the various right wing publications, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, what have you. Um, but you generally tend to gravitate out of the mainstream. So you have to see the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and all that, NPR especially, as kind of the middle of the road, the mainstream. Um, and um, then you've got kind of the left and the right, and that's where I think a lot of people are gravitating, especially if I read what's the Spectator, for example, in the UK, or its US incarnation, or the Daily Mail, um, or other right wing publications, and I see better reporting there on COVID origins than I see in the New York Times. Regardless of my politics, I'm going to read those articles, and I do read them. And I've read some very good articles. Matt Ridley, uh, who's on the conservative side politically, tends to write his stories for publications that are on the more conservative side politically, and I read what he writes because I'm really interested in what he has to say. So I think that I about an hour or so ago, I raised the question of why is the Washington Post all of a sudden starting to run all these really good stories. And this may be one of the reasons, is that they sort of realized that people were not relying on the at the beginning of the pandemic, the Washington Post was doing a terrible job. They were hardly running anything. So, maybe they began to realize that, and they may very well have looked and seen that the Times, it's kind of inside baseball, but they might have looked and seen that the Times wasn't doing a very good job. And somebody there might have said, hey, this is our chance to shine and to pull some readers away from the Times, which is kind of what the Washington Post is all about, really, is getting people to read it rather than the New York Times. And That's been true for a very, very long time. So I think that there's some of that going on. One thing I'd like to just rip off of something you said, Yana, which we haven't talked about explicitly, except in the very beginning, but I know that's something that you're interested in. And that is this business of conspiracy theories. So, as we all know, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about the lab origin idea being a quote unquote conspiracy theory, with the assumption being that a conspiracy theory is defined as something that's wrong and crazy. And I said, in the disclaimer that you read at the beginning when you introduced me, I said I used to think that the lab origin idea was a crazy conspiracy theory. Well, I've been doing a deep dive, and it was told that I could kind of promote my Substack newsletter, so I'm going to do that. michaelbalter.substack.com. I've been spending the last several days doing a really deep dive into the whole issue of conspiracy theories and how they're handled and what they mean. And this is an area that's been delved into by philosophers, excuse me, by psychologists, by social scientists, and many other disciplines of that type, social sciences. And there's no question that the term conspiracy theory has been used and abused to try to stifle and stop conversation. Because the idea is that a conspiracy theory is automatically something wrong and crazy and for which there is no evidence. But what's interesting is when you kind of get into it, it turns out that as I think most people listening probably realize, that there are conspiracies. And, sometimes conspiracies are real. And, Watergate, as we know, was not just one conspiracy, but a number of different conspiracies that were carried out by the Nixon administration. Back then, people were accused of being conspiracy theorists as well, but it turns out that there really was a conspiracy. So when Peter Daszak and, 27 scientists, some of them worked for Eco Health Alliance, published that letter in Lancet in um, February of 2020, calling any suggestion that a lab origin might be responsible a conspiracy theory. What did it turn out? That there was a conspiracy by Peter Daszak to write that letter and make it look like he was not the one who had written it, but that it was some kind of consensus letter by a bunch of scientists. And we didn't know that until US Right to Know got the documents, got the FOIA documents that showed. So I'm not just, guessing here or making wild accusations, that showed in black and white through emails Peter Daszak talking with Ralph Barrick and a couple of other people, Ralph Barrick at University of North Carolina, and saying, let's not sign this letter so that nobody will know it's us behind the letter. And I'm not kidding or exaggerating. Now, that's a conspiracy. So I think that I've gotten very interested in this idea of conspiracies because some conspiracies are true, some conspiracies are real, and maybe it's a misnomer to call a lab origin a conspiracy theory because most conceptions of a lab origin don't really call for a conspiracy. They don't postulate conspiracies. An accident, somebody doing some genetic engineering, in the lab, and the virus escapes, or bringing a bat back from, a cave 1,000 miles away to the Wuhan lab. These are not conspiracies. They're accidents. I don't think there's much evidence that anybody intended to cause this pandemic deliberately or conspired to cause it. But there may very well be a conspiracy in China to cover up the fact that there was a lab leak or a lab origin, and that would be a real conspiracy. So the way that this term is thrown around, I think I would just really caution people to think twice when you hear the word conspiracy theory used in any context, not just COVID origins, but in any kind of context. And, it's interesting. sometimes there are conspiracy theories that are so wrong and so awful and so harmful that we just can't really accept them. Obviously, one of them was when Alex Jones began to claim that the Sandy Hook massacre, killings of children there in Connecticut, did not really happen, but that the parents made it up. And that was outrageous. And I think that the evidence from the very beginning that that had really happened was very, very clear. But you know what's interesting about that is that one of the parents of one of the children who was killed spent years on social media patiently and carefully trying to convince the Sandy Hook conspiracy theorists that his son had really been killed. And you might say, why the hell should that father have had to go through that? But in a lot of ways, he was acting a lot more scientifically and marshaling evidence and saying, yes, my son was killed. No, I didn't make it up. No, it's not, a false flag thing. He was, much more in the keeping of the scientific spirit than those who just simply throw around the term conspiracy theory and don't really look at whether or not there might have been a conspiracy theory. Okay? It was possible that all the parents at Sandy Hook made up the shooting and that their kids are all still alive or on some island someplace or whatever the theory is. Or it's possible that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. It's not complete, there's the Catholic clergy has got a lot of pedophiles in it, so, these things are not completely impossible. But then you muster evidence and you make a decision as to whether there really was a conspiracy or not. And that's what we should be doing. We should not be using the term conspiracy theory in some kind of arbitrary way to shut people up. And we should not accept anything as being described as a conspiracy theory, meaning that it's wrong. We should do our own investigations of these issues.
Michael, thank you. We have a question from Dr. Handler. Um, the question is, Michael speaks of partisan political dynamics resulting in the suppression of the lab leak theory. I was wondering if he has been following the disinformation industry and its expansion under COVID. Does he believe there was any top-down coordination in suppression out of these efforts, or was this a natural, spontaneous alignment?
Well, I think to keep it in the area of COVID origins, I mean, I'm not going to get into masks and vaccines and this, that, and the other thing tonight. But to keep it on the area of COVID origins, yes, the emails make it very clear that both Tony Fauci and Jeremy Farrar and Collins as well, Francis Collins, head of NIH, wanted some kind of scientific paper, quote unquote scientific paper, put out to nip the lab origin conspirizing, as they called it, in the bud. And they, Fauci, in this one series of emails or a couple of email exchanges, where the Fauci is being presented with the possibility of waiting and doing nothing and kind of letting the lab leak idea or the lab origin idea just kind of die out. And he said quite explicitly, no, we can't do that. We can't afford the luxury of doing that. We've got to put something out. And so the proximal origins scientists, Christian Anderson, Eddie Holmes, Brownbaugh, and the others, did just that. They've started putting together a manuscript almost immediately that became the proximal origins correspondence in Nature Medicine. When that appeared, and there was still talk of lab origin, Jeremy Farrar got upset. I think it was either Farrar or Collins or both got upset and said, isn't there something we can do to stem the tide of this conspiracy theorizing? There was a coordinated effort at the top of the public health, hierarchy to try to stem the tide of the lab leak uh, hypothesis. And Christian Anderson, in those very same emails, is quite explicit about that they were trying to basically discredit the lab origin idea, and that was what it was that they were trying to do. So my answer is, Sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there was a conspiracy. To do that, a conspiracy is usually defined as several people, more than one person working together to achieve a certain aim, but doing it secretly so that other people don't know. And if you use that definition, then there was a conspiracy to try to squelch the lab origin idea, beginning in late January and early February of 2020.
Michael, so we're almost out of time.
Yes.
I have just one last question for you. I'll admit that I am not resigned to the idea that we are stuck with mainstream media that is free to be manipulating us into complacency. Rather than equipping us with the information we need to defend our safety and our rights, especially at a time of a global crisis like this pandemic. And I'm wondering, what is your thinking around what we might be able to do to change the status quo? How can we begin working on establishing accountability mechanisms?
Well, I think that that's a very long range goal, because how are you going to uh, get the New York Times, for example, or NPR to do fair and balanced covering of an issue like this? Um, there's both positive and negative sides of being in a free market system. Even though I'm on the left, I sort of see that there are some positive things about it, a free market system. But we do have the ability to have alternative media and alternative publications. I'll tell you something. When the Intercept, and I fault the Intercept for certain things that they've done, like the mistakes they made that sent Reality Winner to jail, which I still have not forgiven them for, but that's a whole other topic. But when I see the Intercept in my inbox in the morning, you were saying, I start tweeting in the morning. That's because I get up and the first thing I do is I read the New York Times, and all this stuff is in my inbox. When I see that, I look at it and I look at every story to see if they've got something that nobody else has got. And very often they do. The same thing is true of TruthTig, the publication for which I've been writing recently. They get a lot of stories that nobody else gets. And that's true of other publications, it's true of The Nation and various progressive publications. And as I said, when it comes to COVID origins, it's true of a number of conservative publications too. So, I think that uh, going elsewhere is, voting with your feet is one way that people can kind of make a difference. I think that the editors and publishers of the New York Times know that the cachet of the Times and the degree to which the Times is considered the paper of record and the last word on any particular subject has been vastly eroded in recent years, and not just because of COVID, because of a lot of different kinds of issues. And but in the long run, what can we do about it? I think that it has to do with training of journalists. I was talking to a friend of mine uh, who's on the faculty of the science journalism program at NYU. Won't name him. And we were talking about the fact that so few of the students, I taught, something like 80 something students over the 6 years that I taught at NYU, went through my classroom, that so few of them ended up being investigative journalists. And we were talking about, okay, what could we do about that? And I think that there are a number of science journalism programs around the country. I would advocate that they should make investigative journalism a much bigger part of the program, so that people would have the option of being real science journalists and not just science writers, as we said, at the very beginning. So it's really kind of a long range thing, but unfortunately, there's no top down mechanism. We can't, in the United States, we don't regulate the media. We don't force the media to do X, Y, and Z. So it kind of has to come from bottom up and not from top down. But there's a lot of things that people can do. Your organization, Biosafety Now, you've put or are putting together with other people the issues of lab biosecurity on the agenda, and it appears to be working because there's really a lot of focus on that issue right now. So, these are the kind of things I think that need to happen. But there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the problem.
Michael, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was an incredible conversation, a real honor to have it with you. And I'm just so grateful for your presence on Twitter. You are an invaluable resource to me and support, even if you don't know it, because we're not in touch every day. But I do look out for your tweets, and I look forward to your new one at 4 or 5 a.m. tomorrow.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks to you and to Bryce and to Biosafety Now. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. It's not often I get a chance to talk for an hour and a half straight, but I welcome the opportunity anytime. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Good night.